seems ironical to me that you talk about distance, and here I live in Melbourne, Australia now, and you live in Umeo. I don't think there's more distance than possible, but it does also mean that through forums like this that we can come together and have similar issues, questions, ponderings. And certainly when you asked me to talk about this topic, it's probably the longest title I've ever had, it was kind of nice to be able to bring together what has been my life. For even though I've retired now from the university, for 40 plus years, my background and my training was as a psychometrician. I'm the person who teaches the courses on research design, statistics, and all those lovely courses which I know members of this organisation love, but it's not always shared by everybody. And I started my work on the concept of unidimensionality. And over the years, I spent a lot of time working in different places around the world. I was the president of the International Test Commission for a period of time, edited the International Journal of Testing, and I was very happy. It's a great profession to have because if you're a measurement person, you can stick your nose into almost any topic and bring along what I hoped was my contribution to the field, bringing together the best possible measurement to answer important problems. And over the years, I had a hobby. And it started as a graduate student in my first American education research conference, 1976, when Jean Glass presented meta-analysis. And it was intriguing. You knew in the room that day that this was something quite dramatically magic. And the best way to learn about them is to do them. So I took up my first job and tried my first meta-analysis and did another one and another one. And then an pivotal moment came when I thought, what if I did a meta-analysis of meta-analyses? Can we change the question about what works in education? Because I'm sure everybody in this forum today knows. We all know the answer. Every teacher knows that they have evidence that they're successfully teaching. Every politician knows that, and every academic knows that. But it doesn't make sense. Not everything works. We remember that as kids ourselves. And so could I change the question from what works to what works best? And away I went. And certainly at the time, I remember, Christina, you were in Auckland. I decided when I went to Auckland in 1999 that I would actually spend some time putting it all together finally and put it behind me. And so that's my hobby over. It took me 20 odd years because the data's easy. It's working out the story. And so I wrote the book, and in 2009, I published it. And it was my 10th book. And I thought it would go like the other 9, which I'm sure you don't remember either. No, it caught on for whatever reason. It sold over a few million copies now, and it started a new business for me. And you say, yes, I have spent a lot of time over the last 10 years looking at that database from multiple angles with multiple people, and also spent quite a bit of time working with a team implementing it in schools. And I'm very proud of my next book, which is in production at the moment, because I'm writing my first book with my son. And that's a really wonderful thing to be able to do. And so what today is about is bringing together my passion on measurement and my hobby on visible learning. And hence the notion of looking at those two halves of my life. The first half, the measurement person, I was on the supply side. How do you create better measurement? How do you create better testing? What are the best conditions? And the visible learning, I turned to the demand side. What can we get out of the assessment movement and make better as educators? And that answer that has been with me for almost my whole career. It ain't the numbers. It ain't the tests. It's the interpretations. And sometimes the lack of interpretation. I see them as two sides to the same coin. And when you talked before, Christina, about validity, I see that very much in terms of, are we making the right interpretations which means we're going to have the right tools to start with, but it's a lot more than just having the right tools. So where I want to start this session is where I have started for the last 10 years, looking at that evidence base. And you can see in 2009, I had 800 meta-analyses. As of today, I'm up well past the 1,800 meta-analyses. Our colleagues still keep producing these things. So I keep still adding them to the database. And this graph still amazes me. When I started, I never expected to see so few influences in that red zone below zero. And as you can see, there's not many. Most of those, nearly all of them, not all of them, but most of those are perfectly sensible, like the effect size of bullying, minus 0.3, the effect size of boredom, minus 0.5. And when you take those kind of sensible ones into account, the 95 to 98% of things that we do to students increases their achievement. We've got to stop saying, I can increase kids' achievement, because everyone can. And this is why our current debate about evidence is misguided, because everybody virtually can provide evidence that their teaching makes a difference to kids' lives, that their policy makes a difference to schools and kids' lives. Wrong debate. The bar is set too low. I want to raise it and say, can we find ways where we can identify those teachers and schools in that blue zone, form a coalition of success around those, and invite those in the yellow to join? And in my political job here in Australia, as the chair of AEA, I keep trying to argue with ministers. Let's not keep finding failure and trying to fix it. We're good at that, but it's not helping. Instead, do we have the courage to identify success and scale that up? And courage is our weakest link. And certainly those of you in starting your career, the biggest massive gap in our evidence base is how to scale. I'm not bad at searching literature. When I ask how many articles can I find in education about how to scale up in education, I'm up to Article 8 in our history. But that's not my big theme today. It's setting the scene about what's in that blue zone. It's not going into all the detail. But a year or so ago, we released a free website with all the data in. In fact, we updated it a couple of weeks ago to the 1,700 meta-analysis. So if you want any of the data, if you want to know what the terms mean, a glossary, frequently asked questions, and so on, look up MetaX. It's there to be used. And my challenge to academics, you don't have to spend 30 years collecting the data. I'm giving it to you for free. I would love you, however, to come up with a different interpretation and beat the one I've come up with. And when you do, I'll be your first supporter. But what I want to look at today is what the big themes are. And it's these big 7 ideas. And when you look down that list, there's no curriculum, there's no age, there's no country, there's no ability grouping in terms of the bright ones and the ones out of the distribution. These are the big ideas that work. What works best for all kids. Of course, every kid is unique. And we have to allow for that, which is why the theme is about knowing thy impact. This is the big ideas about what's underlying that blue zone. How do you implement that in your class? And you can see I've done this here in terms of the students. And this is what we mean when we talk about assessment capable students. I could have the same phrase for teachers, with assessment capable teachers. And it's all about a way of thinking about their learning, their exposure to teaching and classrooms. And it's understanding from the student perspective how they view assessments is where I want to go in this session. Collectively, it doubles, triples the rates of learning when we teach students how to interpret the information from assessment. I ask you the number of times that you do an assessment in your class, whether it be an assignment or a test. You give the results back. For many students, that indicates the work's over. I challenge you all to wait a day so it's not just short-term memory. And then ask your students to write down bullet points, perhaps, a few notes. What did you understand from any feedback or grade you got from the assessment. There's a lot of poverty out there in that domain. We think of assessments as something we do to kids to motivate them. And there are not many students motivated by assessment. We think of assessments as something we do at the end, so we can move on to the next topic. No wonder students don't see them as that valuable. And so how do we turn it on its head and teach students how to be assessment capable? When we actually introduced this policy in New Zealand in around 2007, we got into a lot of trouble. The teachers and the unions got very angry with us, saying if you're going to talk about assessment capable students, you're bypassing the teachers. And we said, no, it's the exact opposite. If we're going to develop assessment capable learners, first, you have to have assessment capable teachers. But all our debates in the last 20 or 30 years has been providing professional learning for teachers to be better at assessment. And maybe we've been successful at improving teachers, but we haven't improved the impact on our kids to the same degree that we'd want. Hence the argument, let's focus on teaching students to be assessment capable, and then we get the bonus dividend of doing that with teachers in the system as well. So what do we mean by it? Well, let's look at some of the effect sizes that underlie where I want to go today. And I've chosen these just as a bit of a sample, and I specifically chose to response to intervention because it depends on good assessment. And classroom discussion I chose because that's another form of assessment. Knowing how to listen back as a teacher to what your students are thinking, discussing, and asking each other questions about. Similarly for the student, and so on down that list. And when you look at the effects, they're all pretty robust. But the number of times I've shown this list, and the immediate reaction is to go to the supply side. Oh, we need to improve the testing. Whereas I want to go to the demand side. No, I want to improve the interpretation based on good assessment. So my argument today is assessment is about tests. It is about observations. It is about looking at student voice and artifacts. And validity in classrooms is about the triangulation of the interpretations from at least those 4 sources of evidence. And what we're trying to do in our visible learning work in schools is to get teachers to work in teams to contest their critique and their interpretation. In the same way today, I'm asking that we should be doing this from students to get them to critique their interpretations of their information from their tests, their observing and noticing, their student voice and the artifacts of their work. And it's the triangulation of those 4 that matter. I want to argue that those interpretations should be about surprise. What did I learn that I didn't know? Because if you can't answer that question, why did you bother doing an assessment? The moment of joy when you discover that you actually have mastered. The aha moment, the discovery. We're actually doing some interesting work at the moment with eye gaze, detecting the aha moment in students long before, 10, 20 seconds before. Sometimes the students know they've made the connection. And then how can we come up with better ways at reconsidering our way of thinking about the world? And that power of feedback. Assessment should have dollops of feedback, but I want to be quite specific about it. As many of you know, feedback's very powerful, but it's also one of the most variable of influences. And finally, I want to look at the when. I think this is a subsidiary question because it's a matter of doing both. As been said many times, formative is when the cook tastes the soup, summative is when the guests taste the soup. And I remind you, when Michael Scriven invented those terms 60 odd years ago, he never talked about formative and summative assessment. Like him, I have no time for the concept of formative and summative assessment. You give me an assessment, I can interpret it formatively or summatively, depending on when, during or at the end. And both are valuable. And I'm sure, as you've heard and I've heard many times, formative is very powerful. It means it needs to be the more robust form of measurement, whereas so often it's seen as second best. Anything's okay, not good enough, not good enough. So that's the big arguments. That's the step I want to take. And I want to cover this session in terms of 5 big themes. But the big arguments, the purpose of assessment is twofold. And the first is, do not presume. Do not presume when you do an assessment that you're going to get the students who do well, and those who typically don't do well. Because if you do that, you're just reifying what was already there. So the mindset to go into any assessment is that sense of do not presume and be prepared to be surprised. Because remember the argument. If you aren't surprised, and if the student's not surprised in some way from the assessment, it doesn't say much. Now, confirmation can be quite powerful, but disconfirmation is even more powerful and should be seen as a positive. So remember those 2 mantras. I'll come back to them. So what are the attributes of assessment capable students? As you read down that list, this to me is, we've got fancy words for these things. We call it self-regulation, metacognition. I think it's simple. When we teach students to become their own teachers, I have the same list. If this was a different topic about teachers, I'd have the same list. But today, it's about students. And these are the attributes. And these are the skills that I argue we should be teaching students. And today I want to highlight 5 themes around these attributes. And I don't know, Christina, I'm certainly happy to make my PowerPoint available, or if you want to take phone pictures, etc. The other thing I'd love to comment at this stage is that I would very much enjoy during the session if you use the chat room to put in comments, put in questions. And I've asked Christina before the session tonight, would she monitor it for me so that I can focus on this, because watching the chat and watching the Zoom is not necessarily the best thing for a presenter to do. And I've asked her to interrupt me so that we can have a dialogue during the session rather than to wait for the proverbial end, which on Zooms don't work as well. So please, anytime you want to ask a question, a comment, a clarification, please put a comment in the chat room.
Yes, I have written this in the chat and encouraged people to ask questions. So I'm monitoring eagerly. I will interrupt you.
Please, thank you. And as I said, talking about assessment capable learners, they're built by assessment capable teachers. And this is what highly effective teachers do, such that students become assessment capable, know how to visibly teach themselves, know what to do when they don't know what to do, know about their progress as well as their levels of achievement. The one that I'm a little obsessed about, know about not only the strategies of learning they have, but what alternative strategies, such as that is if the first one doesn't work, they don't just repeat it. Because if they repeat the same strategy, they get the same outcome. So how do they know what strategies of learning they have? How do they cope with challenge and expectations and understand when good's good enough? So I want to pick up these themes here today and talk about them to illustrate what I mean by developing visible learning assessment capable teachers and students. And let me start with expectations. The effect size of teacher expectations is about 0.45. The effect size of teacher expectations, where those expectations, as Christian Ruby showed, if they're high, they tend to be for all students and teachers are successful. And when teachers have low expectations, they tend to have it for all students, and sadly, they're also successful. And that effect size from high expectations, 0.9. The effect size of student expectations, 1.2. So do you understand your students' expectations when they sit down to do an assessment, an assignment, or their work? Because at that effect size, it's very dominant in terms of the kind of investment they're going to make, the kind of learning they're going to make, almost independent of what you do. So if you don't understand their expectations. Similarly with assessments, we all know about the stereotype threat. it is very, very dominant. If kids think they're not going to do very well on the assessment, they probably won't. So understanding what those expectations are. And our colleague, Christina Ruby Davies, has done a lot of work on this over the years, looking at those high and low expectation teachers. And she goes into classes and she's got a method for working out those high expectation, low expectation teachers. And one of her studies, she actually went into the classrooms and tried to map out a picture of what the differences in actual classroom behaviors were. And I think that's a bit of a sample of her work. Those are profoundly different. In the same way, I would argue that if you looked at those students who had high expectations and low expectations, independent of their prior ability, you get a profound difference about how they think and what they do. Differentiation is the one that always surprises people. Low expectation teachers' concept of differentiation is different activities for different groups of kids. And if you don't think the kids know that they're in the butterflies or the elephants group, you're off your bonkers. Of course they know. They know it's a low expectation. They know they're getting lesser work. The high expectation teachers hardly ever mention the word differentiation, and certainly don't differentiate kids permanently into groups and lower the expectations and challenge for the kids. Their argument is all the students can attain the success criteria of the lessons, but they may take different time and different ways to get there, which is exactly what the Carol Ann Tomlinsons and others take when they talk about differentiation. Same with students. Do they all think they can get to the concepts of success? Our job is to find different ways and different times for them to get there, not to lower the success criteria. So those notions of expectations are extremely powerful. Take Grant Smith as an example. He's a teacher in charge of 3 other teachers in the early childhood program in Catherine Primary School, a very remote part of Australia. At the start of the year, he sits down with his team of 3 teachers, and you can see the 13 success criteria for teaching reading down the side. Along the bottom, you can see all the students across the 3 classrooms that they're working in.
John?
The green stickers? Yes.
I'm sorry, I have questions, but we can take
Yes.
that after if you want to finish.
No, enjoy. Go, you go.
Okay,
Come back
okay.
to Grant.
I have 2 questions. One is from Oscar Skovdal, who writes, are there any age groups you have in mind of students that are capable of making use of assessment interpretation? Or do you mean all the students that are taking the most kinds of assessment?
I'm talking of the lot. Like at the moment, I'm in granddad stage, and I know my 5-year-old is brilliant at interpreting assessments. Unfortunately, she's going to learn, sadly, that it's the teacher's job to do that, and she's going to lose it. 4 and 5-year-olds can do it. Why can't 10 and 12-year-olds and 20 and 30-year-olds can?
Okay. Interesting. We also have a question from Tom Bramley. Should protecting or boosting student self-esteem be a high priority for teachers? And is this compatible with high expectations if those expectations aren't met?
Tom, you've hit a nerve here. In fact, my early career, I actually did a lot of work in the self-esteem area, even wrote a book on self-esteem. It's the bane of our society in one way, but on the other hand, there is no excuse for denting kids' self-esteem. And it is that balance of not embarrassing kids that when they don't know. But let's get real. No one comes into a classroom to learn that which they already know. And so often self-esteem is saying you're doing well when they're not. You're achieving when they're not. And if you think they don't know that, then you're missing something. So I think there's a balance, Tom. Yes, I want the self-esteem of a learner to be very high, which is why I'm passionate about teaching students to interpret their assessments. Yes, I also, like I'm hinting at your question is hinting at, I do care about their sense of self-esteem. I'm not prepared to pay the price of some East Asian countries, which pay an enormous price on self-esteem. I think there is a balancing act, yes. So come back to Grant. The green little stickers, kids can do it. Now the yellow, they can't. Now a teacher can't come into the staff room and change that yellow over to a green. They have to bring the evidence from their observations, from the assessments, from the artifacts, and convince their fellow teachers that the student has mastered that particular concept. And then they celebrate and the joyous celebration when they switch that yellow to a green. And Grant looks at the list every now and then, and if the whole line of green is done, well, obviously, there's no point keeping teaching that. This is using evidence to diagnose, look at the quality of implementation. Think of what else he's doing. They're interpreting. They're listening to each other's interpretations. They're critiquing each other's interpretations. And that's what we need to mimic with our students. How do we get them to use assessments to sometimes question their interpretation, such as Tom is arguing? Maybe I'm better than I think I am. Maybe this is what I don't know yet. So are there resources and teachers to help me learn what I don't know? And feedback. Powerful, but variable. A third of feedback is negative. I've spent 10 or 12 years of my life trying to work out that variability. And when Shirley Clark and I wrote a book last year, it was entirely related, not to the power of feedback, but reducing the variability to make sure that feedback is more powerful. And if we think of assessments, we often think of them in terms of the feedback that we give to students. And we're often confronted that when you ask students about their feedback from assessments, they're not always as encouraging as we are. In fact, I'd go a step further. Before you do an assessment or an assignment next time, before the students start, maybe even before they even tell what the assessment is, ask them to put at the top what grade or mark they think they're going to get. After age 8, they get it pretty right. So what does assessment tell them? Virtually nothing they didn't know already. Surely, for many of those students, our job is to mess up what they think they can achieve and raise the bar. And this is where this power of feedback comes in. Is how do we do that to raise the bar? Here's how we resolve the dilemma. Yes, please.
No, I'm interrupting you again. I have a new question.
No, you're not interrupting me. We're having dialogue.
It relates to the previous picture. A funny passport. She writes, "Are these charts publicly visible? What happens to a kid who doesn't have many greens?"
Well, look, Fanny, I would start in the staff room, yes, for the reason you raised. I know in many schools that I work in, it's in the classroom. Kids don't have those problems if you use as the major criteria of success improvement and growth, not hierarchies of standards. But if you say, we're going to value in this class improvement, now I want both, hence the mantra, progress to achievement. But I do warn you, even when the kids are used to it and they don't have a problem, because they know anyway, make sure you cover it up when the parents come in, because they don't understand. So in general, if you look at Lynn Sharon's work, she says, don't get into the dilemma that you're hinting at there, Fanny. Do it in the staff room. But it's not as if kids don't know. Feedback. Here's how I resolve it. Firstly,
okay. I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sitting here talking.
I'm forgetting. Sorry, Christina. This is good.
No, it's just me forgetting to unmute myself. I have a question from Erin McCabe saying, have you identified the influencing power of expectation? How do you think this links to teacher bias in terms of affecting the validity of marking and interpretation of internal assessments? Did you get that? I'm not very good.
I'm not a great fan of all that bias stuff and expectation. Yeah, it's there and it can be inexcusable. But think of what Christine Ruby Davies is showing. Teachers who have high expectations typically have them for all the students. Where's the bias? Sadly, teachers who have low expectations tend to have them all the students. Maybe there should be bias. I'm not sure bias is the biggest problem. I think it's low expectations. It's not only by the teachers, but also by the students. And so that notion of negative bias isn't as strong. It's inexcusable when it's there. And there are examples when it does occur, and that should not be permissible in any classroom. But in general, it isn't as big a problem as we think. The problem is low expectations, not bias. I want you to think of feedback. Sorry, I want you to think of assessment as a mechanism to feedback. Start that sentence again. I want you to think of assessment as feedback to you about that key question about your impact. Impact about what? What did you have impact on and what didn't you? With whom? Who gained that impact and who didn't? And to what magnitude? And I ask you that the next time you do an assessment in class, give the assignments back and then ask yourself the question, what did you learn about those 3 impact questions? And if the answer is not much, you wasted the kids' time. I'll go a step further. I want to ask the student, and also after the assessment, the same questions. What did the feedback tell you about what you know and what you didn't know? About where you need to go next and how much improvement you've made? And if they can't answer that, I think you've wasted the kids' time too. An assessment capable is teaching them to answer those 3 questions. To resolve the feedback, we've looked at feedback as the answer to 3 questions. Where am I going? How am I going? And where to next? And at 3 levels: content task, the process, and the strategy, self-regulation level. In a nutshell, the reason why I would argue that success criteria are very important is it's critical that students have a concept of what it means to be successful, so that they know how to interpret the feedback and your interpretations, and know how to interpret the feedback from assessments, because it helps them get to their goal. In the same way as they play Angry Birds, they want to get to the next level, and they are quite motivated to get there if they know where they're going. How am I going? Teachers are brilliant at this. They're very good at telling kids, I would argue, how they're going. And the third question, where to next? In light of what you've done, where do you go next? And we've asked thousands of teachers about their concept of feedback. And so if I said to you now, you've got 20 seconds. What do you mean by the word feedback? I want you to do this because it'd be interesting to see if it matches up with thousands of other other teachers.
John, we have a question.
I'm going to pause. No, pause me on this one, Christine. I want people to think first. I'll come back to you.
Okay.
Their concept of feedback. As I said, I've done it with many thousands of teachers, and I have a list. I'm very proud of my list. And if you answer the feedback, I would love to hear it in the chat room, and it doesn't have to start with C. Teachers see feedback as comments, giving corrections, giving clarification, giving confirmation. And it's really interesting when you ask students what they mean by feedback, because overwhelmingly, they say none of these. The one thing that dominates from a student's point of view is feedback helps me know where to go next. Then they say, and then I want to know how to get there. Students are looking forward. So often our assessment's looking backwards. And we've spent a lot of time over the last few years looking at feedback assessment from the student's point of view. And we're building this model on the demand side of what students want from feedback. And I challenge you the next time you give an assessment back, before you give it back, read all your comments, put them in 2 piles. One pile where there's no where to next feedback, so where am I going, how am I going? And one where there is. And don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with how am I going and where am I going feedback. It's the justification for where to next. Give the assignments back. Wait a day and then ask the students to comment on what they understood by the feedback you got. I will bet that those students who got some where to next feedback will be able to talk about it. And those who didn't will say they got no feedback. And I've got videos of me sitting there with my own students with 2 pages, they're holding in their hand, 2 pages of written commentary that I put on their work. And I say to them, tell me about the feedback you got. And they look me in the eye and say, I didn't get any feedback. What they mean, they don't know where to go now. Yes, there has to be opportunities for them to go. So the mantra is, was the feedback understood, heard, and actionable? And like the proverbial tree that falls in the forest and there's no one around it to make a noise, if feedback's not actioned, did it occur? And this is where I want to go beyond the typical argument of assessment and say it's about giving feedback. It's about giving feedback that's heard, understood, and actionable. And we as the teachers in the room have to understand that our feedback as a function of it being actioned. And it's really powerful to see what feedback is actioned, because that's what tells you what effective feedback is. I have no time for that crazy argument that you have to give grades rather than numbers or vice versa. It's not about that. It's about the where to next feedback. And that's what I want to get smarter about. That's what I want students to get smarter about, and teachers. We have to provide the where to next feedback. And so these are the questions that I want you to ask of your students, and obviously of yourselves. And if your students are never asked these questions, or they can't answer them, they're not assessment capable. And I don't think all the power that some of us on the supply side have put into assessments over the years are realizing the benefits of our beautiful psychometrics, if it's not heard, understood, and actionable. Christina, you're going to have another one there?
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. It's so interesting to listening to you. So I never know when to interrupt you. But I have a question, and it relates back to what you said earlier before the feedback section, and that was from Jeanette Elwood. And I'm trying to read this properly. It's a long question. I think that there is always a clash of theoretical positions on learning. A simple one would be psychological constructs, self-esteem, etc., versus social-cultural concepts of participation. We speak of learning as if we all agree on what it means. There is the same as assessment. It is a tension as learning, assessment, feedback, etc., are so complex that what visible means becomes problematic too? Question mark.
Like the irony is that I call my work visible learning, Jeanette. It's not visible. It's in here. The reason I called it that is I want to make it more explicit. And this is one of the powers of assessment, to help make it more explicit. But we've forgotten that we make it more explicit through the assessments, and we forget it's the interpretations we make. So and I'm with you when you say that it's the concept of learning. In fact, I'm going to come to that. I think it's the next topic I'm going to come to, because I would argue very strongly, I probably have a hunch like you, that we spend far too much time talking about teaching and far too little time talking about learning. And it's the learning that I think is the focus. But remember, learning is always about something. It's about whom that we are doing the learning with, and obviously how much. So yeah, I'm with you that we need to be smarter about this concept of learning, and that's exactly where I want to go. It's called the teachable moment. Thank you. Now, before I get there, because you can see there, Jeanette, step 4, let me go to step 3. Feedback thrives on errors. If you get something right, feedback is quite confirming. If you get it wrong, it should be seen as the opportunity. And it was raised in the earlier question about self-esteem. We don't like to wallow in errors in classrooms. It was a great study where they looked at what kids do. What happens in your classroom when a child puts their hand up and gives the wrong answer? 50% of the time, we correct that child. 50% of the time, we ask another student who corrects that child. And less than 3% of the time, we treat that as an opportunity for learn. Now, I know why we do it. Self-esteem. But think what it says to the student. Errors are a mistake. Errors means you don't know. Means you're a bit silly, you're dumb. Don't put your hand up if you don't know. It's like when you ask students, what do you do in class when you don't know? Virtually every kid in the world says the same thing. Put my hand up and ask the teacher. Watch them. No, they don't. The kids who put their hands up are the kids who know or think they know. We are not very welcoming for errors. And if we're not very welcoming for errors, then our whole notion of learning goes out the window, because you don't come to school to learn that which you know. It's what you don't know. The notion of challenge. It means we can't do it yet. If we can't do it yet, it means we're going to make mistakes. We have misunderstandings, which is the point of teaching and assessment, is to inform that. So how can we make errors as opportunities? How can we make like the perfect test for any child is a child who gets 50% right and 50% wrong? Any child who gets 100%, the test was too easy. Doesn't tell them a lot about where to go next. And we have this whole hierarchy in our schools about achievement. And I would certainly argue in a different forum that our obsession with achievement sometimes can be our killer, because it privileges certain kids and it says to many kids that if you aren't getting perfect grades, this place is not for you. And that's sad. So how can we get away from this notion? But students dare not be wrong, dare not be challenged, and dare not fail. And you know those students in your class. Too many of our so-called gifted students are like this, including their parents. And I find it a fascinating question to ask, why is it so many gifted kids don't become gifted adults? Less than 2% of child prodigies go on to be gifted adults because of this.
John,
yes.
Interrupting again, but you encouraged me to do so. I have a question on this topic, or what you mentioned earlier. Is Damien Merchant asks you, you mentioned earlier that you dislike the terms formative and summative assessment. What about AFL, assessment for learning, and AOL, assessment of learning? Are these any more palatable to you, or is the concept themselves that are problematic?
Well, they serve their purpose in the time, and we really got into the prepositions very nicely. But even Dylan Williams would argue it didn't have much success because many people still saw it about assessment and tests and went back to that whole thinking about we give tests to kids. I want to move it to the other extreme, which is why I've tried to invent this phrase of assessment capable students, to focus on the interpretation side. And too much of that assessment for and of and as learning didn't get to the interpretation. That was the intention, and it was a great intention, but it didn't quite get there. So yes, it's okay, but I want to move it to the next step.
Thank you. Two more comments. I think one is a comment and not a question really. It's Mary Richardson who comments, the idea of accepting error is problematic as we are trained to believe that it's stupid to make mistakes. More broadly in society, there is an aversion to error. Public vilification of error is endemic, so it's such a challenge to say something different in schools. And then we have a question from Aldina.
Just on that one,
yeah.
Absolutely agree that we have vilified error, and that's what we have to turn around. We have to demonstrate to students that error is an opportunity to learn. And the other one?
Yeah, and there's a question. I'd like to know, it's Aldina Lobo who asks, I'd like to know what Hattie thinks about the relationship between high stakes testing and formative assessment. Thank you.
Sure. Can I leave that question slightly aside, Aldina, because I want to come back to that in section 5.
Yeah.
Then let me get there.
Yeah.
Back to errors. There's a meta-analysis. Oh, 0.15 is pretty small. This is pondering on errors. And the message here is that when the focus is on the content, the task side, correct, incorrect is the right response. But when it's in the relationship and the deep side, that's when you want kids to wallow in the learning pit, wallow in error. There's a right time for error, there's a wrong time for error. So often, as just was pointed out, we don't like error because it shows our lack of knowledge. Fix it. But welcome the error and welcome alternative viewpoints and explore error when we're looking at relationships and how we're seeing transfer and how we're going into conceptual arguments. And so that's one of the issues with feedback and error. There's a right time for certain kinds of feedback and there's a wrong time. And so when you go into the learning pit, it's after the students have sufficient knowledge, and the focus of the activity in the learning pit is about the relationship between the ideas of that knowledge. Sending the kids into the learning pit, wanting an error, and they don't have the knowledge is a very unhealthy situation. So let's get smarter about that. Almost 2 parts of our teaching. Which part is about the content? When do we stop teaching more content and spend time on relating ideas? And that's the time to go in the learning pit. As you know, Christine, I have 3 boys, and they were brought up in North Carolina, and they went to school there. Michael Jordan was their hero at the time, North Carolina, and that was the poster they had on their wall. And now I have 4 granddaughters. So I hunted hardly for a female role model, and I found one in our own Ash Barty. I want all of us to spend a lot more time. Failure is the learner's best friend. Failure is where assessments come into their element if we focus on the where to next, based on what we don't know, to get to that success criteria. Interestingly, in COVID, social media, students are more willing to talk over their social media. You know, the apps like Edmodo, kind of like Facebook with all the without the downsides. They are willing to talk about what they don't know to their friends and to the teacher that they're not prepared to say even when the teacher's standing beside you. So I think we need to be a lot smarter at seeing the social revolution that the students have gone through that we haven't gone through yet as educators, and welcoming the opportunity to do that. In COVID time, there was more open discussion about what you knew and what you didn't know amongst peers that happens in the classroom. So often the students wait for the teacher to answer. So they don't have any acknowledgement of errors and their own social interpretations and constructions. I think this is an exciting moment. So I come back to this concept of learning. And I think you're right, asking the question about what we mean by learning. I think it's also fascinating to ask this question. How many tests do you actually have of achievement? And I have a hunch the answer is not tens and 20s or even hundreds of thousands, tens of thousands. Any teacher can sit down in a minute and create an assessment of achievement, good or bad. But how many assessments do we have of learning? And that begs your question that you asked before, Jeanette, about what do we mean by learning? We did what I did in Visible Learning was a meta-synthesis related to achievement. What we've also finished a few years ago was a meta-synthesis with relating to learning strategies. And we started by looking at 400 different strategies, thinking we'd end up with the top 10 or 12. And it turned out that the same strategy worked in this circumstance, didn't work in that circumstance. So we had to end up, oh, sorry, I'm ahead of myself. Sorry, stop, pause. I got excited there and went ahead of myself. I want to start with the question you asked, Jeanette. And I think this is a really key question you've asked, but I'm not going to answer it specifically right at the moment. I want you to ask that in your school. Like, ask a sample of students and teachers separately, what do you mean by learning? Who's the best learner in this class? We've done this many, many, many times. Teachers usually have a very rich description of what learning is. Sadly, for many students, learning is coming to class well prepared, sitting up straight and watching the teacher work. Compliance is dominant. Engagement is seen by students and teachers as doing the work. And in a lot of doing, there isn't much learning. That is not what we mean by learning. So what we've been doing in many schools now is we don't have an answer, but we have a process. And in that process, we ask a sample of students, a sample of teachers. We put it up in the staff room. If we get alignment, perfect. More often than not, we don't. I don't know why that screen.
We have a little less than 10 minutes to go.
Yep, I'm on time at this moment. There's a great article at this one school, Harvest Home. They did this, asked their teachers, asked their students. And they came up with 7, and I always argue never get more than 7. And if you look around on the internet, you'll find many schools have done this. They come up with different words. These are the Harvest Home learner dispositions. And the argument is across the school, not in each class, but across the school. These are the 7 things we value. And what the school now is doing is they're saying at least once a day, in one lesson, teach some of these skills. For each of these 7, they've developed a skills descriptor, a rubric that is exposed to the teachers and the students. And I particularly like the Collaborate one because that's the one we worked on the book Collective Student Efficacy last year. Most people put kids in groups and they don't teach them the skills to work in groups. And I think it's a really critical thing. But this notion of finding out what it means to be a learner, and I've done this in my academic classes, and I've done it with my PhD students. What does it mean to be a learner? It's a very rich conversation. Sometimes it's a sad conversation because I've made assumptions and presumptions which are not shared. Now, the other reason I particularly like this article, it was my first article by my son that he ever wrote, not me. So great article, happy to send it to anyone. But my point being is, to answer your question, Jeanette, I think we need to start by asking the students and our fellow teachers what they mean by learning. I have a model. I'm not going to explore it in detail today, but it works from the basis of how you first teach the content and students acquire that, how you consolidate it, how you then move to the deep thinking, the relationships and ideas, to consolidating it and transfer. And what we found is the strategies differ depending where you're on the learning cycle. What we also found is if you look at the 400 different teaching methods that Bob Mazzano has outlined, other than about 10 of them, none of them align with learning. Our teaching is random. No wonder the students are allowed to pick their own adventure when it comes to the strategies. I think we need to be smarter about aligning our teaching with the nature of the learning that's required of particular tasks and aligning our tasks so they move from the surface to the deep to the transfer. The other thing we're doing is we're asking that question about assessment. And I hope by Christmas we'll have released a free website with assessment in it, looking at those top 12 strategies so that the student or the teacher can see how well they're going. And if they click on any of those, that will take them to resources to improve those strategies. And I hope you work with me. How can we use assessment smartly to not only look at achievement, but look at the strategies and the progression as well to help students better understand where to next. The final one is coming back to that notion of formative and summative. And I'm very proud that Michael Scriven, who invented the term 60 years ago, he and I are in the process of writing a book at the moment. He's 96. I'm not sure I'll be writing books at 96. I hope I'm around to read them, but obviously very influential in my life. And as I said, he never used the word formative and summative testing. He used the words formative and summative evaluation. And the underlying theme about my work in the last few years and my talk to you here tonight is to be smarter about what we mean by evaluative thinking. That's what we argue is the essence of our profession as teachers. That's the essence of assessment capable students. The so what question. How valuable is it? What I know now that I didn't know before? Are we prepared to stop and smell the roses of the successes that we have? And I mentioned before video games. If you look at how students play their video games, they know what their prior score is, their last level. They know the Goldilocks principle of setting success criteria, not too hard, not too easy, not too boring. They also know that when the students know what the level is, they will seek feedback. Oh, listen to that. They will seek feedback. They will seek assessments to help them move up to get close to success. And when they get there, they don't do what a lot of teachers do. They say, oh, well done. You've got there. Now go out and play. No, they raise it. And the kids keep going up. And if the kid doesn't get to the next level, unlike teachers, the computer system, video games don't say, you did your best and lower the success criteria. No, they keep it. And many of our kids are, like me, enamored with playing the game of learning, seeking the assessments, being prepared to be wrong, seeing failure as the learner's best friend. And I think we've got to be smarter as testers, test makers, psychometricians, and measurement people, and argue that the quality of our assessment is a function of whether the information was heard, understood, and actionable. Of course, it's based on quality assessments, but that is only the supply side. How do we move to the other side, on the demand side? You asked about national assessment. In a nutshell, when Christina was there back in the early 2000s, we created the New Zealand assessment scheme, both high stakes and low stakes, so one assessment. The teacher goes in, creates an assessment, between 10 and 20, 30 minutes, completely aligns with the curricula on any day of the year. They decide on what they think is the distribution of ability in the class. Really important for creating the assessment, and we'll come back to that in a moment. They decide that the assessment is about the curriculum, what they're teaching, not this mile-wide, inch-deep, typical high-stakes assessment, which I think has got very little going for it other than a substitute IQ test. No, I want the assessment to be about how kids are progressing in the curriculum. It then goes away and creates an assessment that meets those specifications. The database is around 200 to 400 million assessments in the database. The assessment comes back to the teacher with less than a half a second, and they can look at it. They administer the test, and then the sizzle is all of the interpretation. And we spent a lot of time on these graphs. Take the middle there, mathematics scale. This is a school. Year 4 kids, the red is my class, my school. The blue is the national norms. And you can see in that school, the kids progress from year 4 to year 5, but there's zero progression from years 5 to year 6 to year 7 to year 8. And that, sadly, is not uncommon. The teachers give the kids harder work, but the kids are still performing at the same level. The kids can get back specific specifications of what they've achieved, what their strengths are, what their gaps are, and where to go next. And this graph, which is common across the country, is poured over by kids and teachers.
John, we
What
have
goes on?
a couple of minutes.
Where do I go? I'm going to finish this, Christina, and then come back.
Okay.
And then the where to next. And what we're proud of, it's a voluntary system. 80% of teachers in New Zealand are using this test 20 years after it was implemented. And it's been very successful as a high stakes and low stakes. It is about helping the teacher interpret. About 20% of the schools allow the kids to use it themselves. And I think that's where we need to go if we're going to have assessment capable students. I'm going to miss that. So my themes. Let's not presume, and let's be prepared to be surprised. Let us open our eyes to what our assessment tells us, to critique and enhance our interpretations. And that's my argument about assessment capable students. Christina, what's the question? I think we have time for this last.
Thank you, John. Actually, we have a number of questions in the. I asked people, said that maybe we wait with them until the end. And we have.
You asked this, and after this session, I won't get off.
I'll
answer.
Okay.
I'll answer in the chat room to them all.
Okay, that's great. Well, thank you so much. An hour is too short. I want to hear more. And you mentioned me being in New Zealand back that 10. When was it? 12 years ago. And it was fantastic. And I actually went with you to a school, a primary school with quite young kids, very low achieving school from a socioeconomic low background area. And I remember you communicating assessment results in a type of feedback way. It was very quantitative and it was very statistical, and I was so amazed how they understood it, how they liked it, how they felt like heroes because you could show them where their weaknesses had been and what they had improved on. So that was a really great experience for me. And you have made a great impact, at least I know in my country, there's not one teacher who doesn't know who you are. But we have a question from Stuart, and he asks, and I think we can take a little bit time from the break, because he says that you have received critique also for combining disparate studies to arrive at one effect size. How do you respond? Have you heard that criticism?
Oh, look, I have the world's best critics, and on that particular one, yes. It is about when you go to the supermarket and you look at apples and oranges and you make decisions and you put them together in a fruit salad. You need to do it very carefully. You need to do it very transparently. And so, yes, I do look at multiple perspectives. But what I spent 20 years on was trying to understand what the common theory was underneath it. And so I didn't stop at the data. I went well beyond that. And I may be wrong in the interpretations. And this is why I throw the challenge out. There's all the data. You have an interpretation, and I'm delighted when people take up the work and they come up with different interpretations. I cannot believe the luxury that I have that people actually care to critique my work. I think that's how we progress in academia. So bring it on. If I've got it wrong, tell me. I'll be the first to agree with you, and I have agreed with many critics.
Okay, thank you. We have a couple of other questions too. I wonder if we should take them during the break, or if do you have time to answer in writing, do you think, in the chat, or do you want me
what I think, you made the point in the opening about it's a long day. What I suggest we do is that I stay on, I answer all the comments in the chat room, and people can see the answers to everybody and do it that way.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. And thank you for taking the time. I know it's very late in the evening. I know that you're very busy. I think you're at another conference or giving a course in America or something. So you're really multitasking these days. Very happy. Great to see you. And I hope you will follow AEA Europe, what we do, and maybe
we'll see each other in Dublin.
Yes, I hope so. Okay, thank you everyone, and thank you. We have a break now, and we will come back in 15 minutes for the next keynote. It's the award winner, Rafael Paschini. So go and grab a cup of coffee. You can follow some of the comments in the chat. We will have a poster session after lunch. And so see you soon.